Matt, it's really great to meet you. I know you've met Manir from our team and our in conversations with a lot of our partners and so on. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk today. So tell me a little bit about your background and how you landed where you are and what you're currently up to.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I started my career in the beer business. I'm a advanced cicerone, which is like a sommelier for beer, and I did all different stuff in the beer industry. I started in the retail side, right when craft beer was kind of becoming a thing again, so around 2007, 2008 range. Um, then was very fortunate. One of the liquor stores I worked at, the son of the owner started his own beer brand called Clown Shoes, and I was able to transition from managing the beer. We had a great selection of all the craft beer and stuff, and um, I transitioned into helping with the craft beer brand. So we were a contract brewery. So we partnered with a local brewery, which at the time was had plenty of excess capacity, and took a very bold marketing position and created some really cool, unique things like Belgian IPA, Black IPA, different imperial stouts that were at the time very new and exciting. And because of that, we were in demand almost immediately, and were able to grow our distribution. I think we grew into 31 states in less than 2 years.
Outstanding. I'm going to interject here because what all everything you just said is fascinating and we can go down a million different paths from there. So
Sure.
I just want to take a beat. In 2007, was it everything was Pilsner heavy and that was before the IPA craze?
Yeah, it was right. That was kind of right at I think around 2005 might have been like what the professionals would say was like the beginning of the craft beer renaissance there. But I honestly got real lucky. I caught the wave and, made a pretty good career out of it for about a decade. But yeah, it was, you know, people were coming in and I always remember the first one I had that really got me into it was a Stone Arrogant Bastard Ale.
Dude,
Um, yeah, classic.
it's classic. You know what's
Yeah.
also classic? The Samuel Smith oatmeal stouts.
Yes,
In
absolutely.
the
Sam.
90s,
Yeah.
like that was my drink, man.
Yep. Yeah, and it was like all I had to do was order that stuff and put it in my store and talk to people about it,
Off the
and
shelf.
we blew up, and it was
So at the time you were a contract manufacturer or were you leasing somebody else's space? How was the relationship?
it was a pure contract. So we'd say we need 500 cases of this next week, make it happen,
So
and
they would brew on
yep,
your recipe and you would be there tasting, overseeing and working through the process. But at that point you're asset light. At that point you're
very,
just building what you think you're going to or bottling what you think you're going to sell
yep.
and then, so that's fascinating. So did you have any concerns about your intellectual property?
Not really. It was a very like grip it and rip it kind of business model,
Got
because
it.
it was getting into the territory of first mover advantage. Like we had some very unique beer styles, like the black IPA was a big one where it was this
Never heard
like
of that.
right,
Yeah.
it was right at the beginning of the IPA craze. People were finally going, I want dark beer. Not something that happens very often in the history of beer consumption in this country. Um,
Right. We had Guinness and that was about it.
yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
And Guinness, funny, Guinness has got less calories and alcohol than Bud Light.
You
It's
serious?
yeah, yeah. That
Yeah.
the
Oh.
tradition of English and Scottish Irish ales was that they were very light beers. They would drink a lot of it.
Remember
Um,
Killian's Red?
yes, yeah,
God,
yep. The only Irish beer made in Colorado.
I haven't seen those guys in. All right, let's actually because beer to me is fascinating. We can have a whole other podcast about that. So you were in beer for 10 years. You rode the
Yep.
wave, and then how did you transition into the THC world?
So, I was always in it. I don't tell my old employers in the beer business, but I've been around weed, selling weed, buying weed for, since I learned about what weed was.
Word.
Yeah. And, never, I was always, I had another job, so I was pretty casual with it.
Yeah.
But I kind of noted that the people who brew beer and sell beer, who I was interacting with a lot, also consumed cannabis quite frequently.
Yeah.
So had a good business opportunity and, spreading the love back when it was illegal.
Yep.
And I had gotten into extraction just as a hobby, literally like 2008, using a
Are you
turkey
talking
blaster, turkey
bubblehead
baster, butane. Actually, I had the whole
as a
like
hobby?
turkey baster setup. Yeah, it was like new. I couldn't find anybody that sold it back then, so I just started making it myself and um, made a lot of friends because of it, and got connected with some really cool weed people that I'm still connected to. Almost 18 years later. Um, and so it always been something I loved, and my kind of center of my cultural world outside of the beer industry. When I left beer, I was running operations for a craft beer distributor called the Mass Beverage Alliance. So we were owned by the five Miller Coors distributors in the state, but we're a centralized place for craft breweries. So they could sign one contract and then get five distributors. And I handled the logistics, purchasing, we handled sales. So it's kind of an easy route for the small breweries to gain access to the massive Coors Light, Miller Light infrastructure of distribution in the state.
And
Uh,
it gave you access to what would later be used for track and trace, right? Like you're already getting into a highly regulated distribution
sure.
world. And so that translates fairly straight.
Alcohol is not as regulated as people would assume it would be. I mean, we would,
All right.
you buy stuff, you sell it, you tell the government what you bought, and you pay the taxes. That's it. They don't come and double check the numbers. They don't, they've
Oh,
effectively completely stamped out the illegal distribution
yeah,
of alcohol.
right.
So, it economically does not make sense to produce and sell your own alcohol illegally, because you can buy it, so ludicrously cheap from a liquor store now that there's no point. So and then those are state law backed licenses. They're a huge privilege to get one of those things. And so they're very inclined to
Self
accurately
regulate.
report everything,
Yeah.
um, or risk, having their state granted protection over their territory in jeopardy. And that is not something you want to
So the
mess with.
enforcement isn't there, but the regulatory compliance all is, and there's no incentive to break that.
Right.
Zero.
Right.
All right. Got
And you look at cannabis in Massachusetts right now. The black market is still a thing here. It's still a thing in every state. And you look at how metric and the state compliance systems are set up. They really are designed to prevent the transfer of the product to the black market, and hence ensuring their tax payments on that product. And until economically we get to a point where the black market does not make sense anymore, it's always going to be I think a heightened regulatory environment for cannabis, which unfortunately comes at a cost and then prevents the economic stamping out of the black market.
That's exactly it. It used to be, people would think that, oh, well, each state has their own regime and states can be state by state and state and state. But we see, I went to New York a couple of years ago and I saw California products on the shelves.
Sure.
I mean, there's a regulatory framework, and there's also a tremendous amount of incentive to just blow right past it.
Yeah.
It's really broken.
Yep.
When you look at alcohol as you've described it, and we look at cannabis, it's hard to get there from where we are
Right.
today.
Yeah. Yeah. And to be, to compare it to alcohol, I mean, we're in the, what, 1941 after Prohibition right now. They didn't figure out this stuff that fast either. They've been
Right.
doing this. They've been selling alcohol for 100 years to arrive at the systems they've arrived at now. We're still in the post-prohibition days here, where I'm sure there was tremendous chaos in the U.S. alcohol markets.
Yes, and the barrier to entry for cannabis is much lower.
Right. Right.
So it's harder. And also, like the economics of the post World War II boom are far different than the economics we're looking at coming up.
Yeah.
So I understand that. I just think the pathway is going to be completely different. So jumping back into it, you've got your chemistry set, you're doing your thing. Where
Yep.
are you getting the material from? Are you growing also at that time?
I've never been much of a grower myself. I was, procuring very high quality flower to make extracts from the guys that I made friends with once they found out I knew how to make extracts, and experimenting. So it was exclusively cured flower, and the knowing what we know now about butane extraction, I mean, we were open. I always did it in my backyard. I had enough safety heads up or wherewithal to not do it in the kitchen.
Sure.
And made a point of, when I taught people how to do it, make sure you're not in your, I don't want you to get killed doing this. It's not worth it. But, you open blast it into a pie plate, and sit it on some hot water for a little bit to bubble up, and then you popped all the bubbles with a blowtorch and started dabbing. And I actually had to make my first dab rig myself because
Really?
you couldn't
Yeah.
buy one.
You know, it's
And
funny. One of my first meetings, I'm going to take a side. In 2016 or 17, I'm in Colorado trying to wrap my head around the whole situation. And I sat down with a meeting with a couple of investors, and they had a portable dab station. First one I had ever seen, but they dabbed 5 minutes into the meeting. And it was probably the shortest meeting that I've ever been in any
yeah,
industry. It just ended very quickly. Beth Myers remembers those days too. It's it was a moment in time. And so
yeah.
you built your own dab rig because nobody else did. And were you the most popular guy in your neighborhood?
Certainly, there was this moment. I was at a head shop, and I was looking for glass to do it with, and I
And they thought
kind
you
of
were going to smoke crack, or
I kind of can't control. I have a loud, deep voice, so I said, like, "Oh yeah, I make this oil at my house," and every single person and the workers, they all snapped their necks and looked
right?
at me and were like, "You make this stuff?"
Yeah,
So yeah, it was easy to make friends with the having a pocket full of shatter back then, when people just hadn't even seen it
yeah,
before. They'd heard about it online,
yeah.
but you know,
I mean, we were all scraping the bottoms of our bowl for hash at that point, right? So okay, so let's jump into you've got your rig, you're doing your thing. How does that turn into the legal business that you have now with Native Son?
Sure. So, really, as I was ending, my last couple of years in beer distribution, the market started falling off a little bit.
Hmm.
Hard sodas and seltzers had come out, and I could see from my position, especially, I was dealing with the breweries, and flowing the beer through my company. I started seeing the trends of, and stop me if this sounds like cannabis, um, everybody trying to build their own manufacturing, borrowing money, investing in huge amounts of capacity based off a very short window of what seemed like very strong sales. But when you're making a little bit of beer, it's not that hard to sell it all. When you make a lot of beer, very hard to sell it all. And simultaneously, all these different companies all taking the same highly leveraged push into this market, which then we're looking at and going, we're losing volume for the craft beer segment to seltzer, and hard soda and vodka. So, I usually use the story when I talk about this of the grapefruit IPA. There was a trend with the Ballast Point grapefruit IPA had come
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Ballast Point sold for $1 billion to Constellation. And, following that, I got 30 calls from different breweries going, how much of our grapefruit IPA do you want to buy? And I had this real, like, kind of wake up moment of like, the music has stopped.
And that's about the time that the bourbon craze started taking
Exactly.
off.
Yep. Yeah. And that craft approach to it, that people really love that. The artisanship behind making these products, other segments of the industry started really pushing into that. And then I'll tell you, the flavored seltzers, the alcoholic seltzers, really destroyed
Yeah.
the forward double digit momentum of craft beer.
100%. And also, what happened to Zima? They missed their moment. They were too early.
Too early. Yeah. Yeah, and that's and those are cyclical trends. So the alcohol industry, it's had a long time to mature,
Yeah.
and now you see this kind of interesting trend where, I mean, look at what happened with tequila. The craft tequilas were booming, and now everybody with $3 million and a dream has got their own tequila brand out there, and they're all craft. They're all coming from the same place in
Yep.
essence, and
Wait until
same
they
in
discover what you
whiskey.
can do with gin.
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to happen.
Yep. Yeah,
So,
and most gin is just they buy grain neutral alcohol
yeah,
and steam it through some pine needles and then call it a
some
craft gin.
vinegar and off they go.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So licensing starts, right? I assume that's about when you started saying, "Oh shit, I
Yes.
should get into it."
Yeah. I honestly, I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I went on Craigslist and I typed in marijuana jobs, and two popped up. I applied for both, and I got my first cannabis job was with a company called Theory Wellness. I was they had built out or almost finished building out their it was a small grow with a retail store inside of it. And I came on, and it was a bunch of very young guys. I was 30 at the time, and I was the oldest person there. um, and it was crazy exciting, and it's something I had always wanted to do, but didn't want to do illegally anymore.
Yeah.
And so I saw what was happening in beer and took the leap of faith, and was very fortunate. We ended up. I got to learn from some really brilliant guys on the ins and outs of the cannabis business. A lot they had spent time in Maine and California. I took a real affinity to the technical parts of growing, the building design, the HVAC and mechanical components to it, and used my logistics skills and business skills from the beer industry to help us put something together that could work and scale. And we were the sixth licensee in Massachusetts, and our retail store in Great Barrington, Mass, was the sixth recreational license when recreational was legalized. And I believe we were the closest legal place to buy cannabis from Manhattan
Brilliant.
for several years.
Brilliant.
So the founders of Theory, made the genius move to locate their store in a sleepy little Western Mass town, that ended up being a huge success, and really outperformed anybody's expectations. And we had just a tremendous amount of fun Um, like having to deal with all, it's a great problem to have. How do we deal with how successful we are? Um,
And you learn a lot of things the hard way when you're
yes.
having those scaling issues, right? I
Yeah.
often talk to our team about how scaling is very uneven.
Yeah.
And you have to look for all the cracks across the entire sidewalk. It's not just what's right in front of you.
Yep.
And you have to be able to see those out, pretty far out. And so my assumption is that you've learned from those mistakes. And when you started doing your own brand and building your own facilities, you were already seasoned at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I tell people, my team here at Native Sun, our leadership team is exclusively people who have been operating in Massachusetts since the medical days. I really believe in this, that you only get one opportunity in this industry to be able to afford to learn from your mistakes.
Right.
And back then, I mean, it wasn't uncommon to be retailing pounds for $9,000, and it was cheaper to produce it back then than it is today.
Yeah. And it was
Um,
garbage. I mean, honestly, looking back,
yeah, and
quality has changed a lot.
yeah, yeah, and that was just the most incredible learning opportunity for this burgeoning industry that anyone could ask for,
Yeah.
where we could literally afford to screw everything up and had enough impetus to figure it out because of how the volume was going. It was hard to maintain the level of demand for the product, so it forced us to break everything and then fix it extremely fast without suffer. I mean, obviously, you're wasting money. You screw something up, you throw a batch away, whatever. It's like, you know, we can we can afford to do that and move on and not make that mistake again. Um,
And that's the first mover advantage, right? But if you're not
Absolutely.
learning from those mistakes as you're growing, that second mover comes in.
Yeah.
If you're not fixing it fast enough. And so when you were building out that first, in that first generation, were you watching the other guys from sitting on the sidelines taking notes? Or was it really just a question of staying focused and just burning through everything and going, going, going?
I typically would find my support from outside of the cannabis industry people. I didn't really, we had friends and connections, and definitely like learned from other cannabis companies to a degree. But the areas that I focused on with efficiency and throughput, lean manufacturing, the technical side of things, the engineering, the science behind how to build a grow room and how the plants react to these environments. You know, I think my willingness to pick up the phone and call someone who might know something about it from experience was just tremendously helpful. And
Yeah.
that's you can't be afraid of asking people for help, even if they've never even met you before, because most people want to help, and especially if they have some knowledge that they can transfer to you, it's I found it unlikely that they'll react negatively to being asked.
100%. People love being smart.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's funny because a lot of entrepreneurs won't ask questions because they're afraid of giving up too much intellectual property. And to me, that's a sign of immaturity because at the end of the day, ideas are cheap, as they say, and execution is everything.
yeah,
Now, there are obviously things you don't want to necessarily disclose, but being open with a stranger often disarms them and gets you that conversation that you're looking for. And you never know where that's going to go down the line.
yeah,
And one of
yeah,
the things about the cannabis industry that I love so much is just how inquisitive people are. And it is still early days, and so there is a lot of knowledge sharing that happens. You don't get to see an industry being built very often, and
no,
being being where we are now, like you got the glimpse of that when you were in the craft brew world, because that's,
Mhm.
a sub industry within a much larger industry. But frankly, there's not a lot of opportunities like that, right? Early days in the iPhone apps and all that other stuff.
Yeah.
But here we are in this moment in time. So you decide to go out on your own and start Native Sons. Native Son.
I actually did not start Native Son. It was
Ah,
founded by father and son team. But as
now
they
the name
got
makes a little more
into,
sense.
yeah, yeah. So as they got into the build out of the grow, similarly with Theory, they said, okay, we need to bring someone in here who can, you know, knows
Operate.
what they're doing with this asset we built and can manage this thing and bring on a
Yep.
team. And so I joined the company in 2022,
Hmm.
and I had left Theory in 2021 and took 6 months off and did a little consulting, and then found these guys. And my read on the cannabis industry was vertical integration is at least in Massachusetts. So it had to be a vertically integrated facility. Having that ecosystem where you're, at least to the maximum degree that you can get, not reliant on wholesale sales of your cultivated products, is just critical to building a healthy company in this state.
What is the spread between, house brand and, third party products being sold at the dispensaries at this point?
We target around 50%. Some months it's 40. That we don't make any edibles. I don't do any distillate products. So our cultivation facility just produces flower.
I
We
see.
outsource our extraction and pre-roll manufacturing and all that to third parties. So we really have a very simplified, streamlined facility here that's just focused on high quality flower. And by having our retails, we can control we can offer a really, really high quality flower product at a very reasonable price because I'm vertically integrated. It's my supply chain.
But you're not, right? You're somewhat vertically integrated.
Yeah. Yep.
You're using
Yep.
3PL or whatever the phrase is in that world for, your processing. Are you drying yourself or are you giving wet flour?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. So we own the process from cultivation through drying, curing, trimming, testing. Then we
But
essentially
you're not
package
packaging.
everything. Not anymore. Actually, I have a partnership with a robotics company that is just kicked off in our facility here, where we have um, you know, there there's a fully automated flower pre-roll vape cart packaging setup, and we're offering that as like a co-packaging services. So I look at the market here, and I've been involved with packaging cannabis. The entire time I've been in this industry,
Hmm.
it's very inefficient for small operators, and because of the way the licensing is in our state, where you can only have three retailers,
Hmm.
so you have very fragmented companies, and no one economically can justify you know the expense of these very large, expensive, complicated automations, because they're not going to do enough volume to
Yeah.
and I've seen it. I mean, I've done it. I've bought the pre-roll machines. I've seen many companies buy these things, and they're you end up with a machine that produces a lot of inventory that is
Spitting
not
fallow.
ready to sell. Yeah,
Yeah. Like if
uh,
you're using it 20% of the time, you'll never get the ROI.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And they all promise you, like, we'll give you, you'll be able to make 100,000 pre-rolls a week, and
You got
in
to
all
sell all that.
reality, yeah, in all reality, no one can sell 100,000 pre-rolls a week. What's the point of this machine?
Right.
Um, but with our approach here, it being intentionally set up as a scalable co-packing solution, and we can consolidate the inefficiencies of cultivators into a system that can more economically benefit the cultivators in this state at a time when we really need it because we have oversupply problems. We have a very fragmented retail landscape. So the cultivators are under serious pressure, pricing pressure, margin pressure, supply pressure. And so typically like in any market like this where you have like even with craft beer, I went through this already. You have a proliferation of independent producers, then you have the corresponding overproduction because no one coordinates, then the perceived demand drops, prices follow, and then the next step is consolidation.
Well,
So
in cannabis, the next step is seeping through the state lines,
sure,
right? Like
sure,
as you described, alcohol doesn't have that.
right.
Cannabis has a lot of folks that end up in over their head as the market matures.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's in our state, like you can't do anything if you grow too much weed. You can't do anything with it. There's no other market.
Right.
There's no distillate is so cheap here. It's you know you grow it indoors, you're losing money turning it into distillate to just get it out the door. So it's really balancing the production to the demand, and real world economics are coming into play, but I think the solution to the problem long term is the industry needs an opportunity to consolidate in some way, and we're artificially kind of prevented from doing so because of the way the regulators set it up. But they used the three-store cap was a liquor rule that was the same for liquor stores up until about 15 years ago. They changed it. So they had a 90 year long period where, a liquor retailer could only own three licenses. But the fatal flaw they had was that is a rule for retailers that cannot be vertically integrated, whereas cannabis is vertically integrated. So by applying some of the rules, but not all of them, it's created this situation where we just have their. I don't know the real. I don't think anyone knows the real numbers of the true production. Maybe the state does, but none of us do. The true production, the true consumption in the state, but I think everyone's guess is that we're producing far too much cannabis for this
Yeah.
market.
Every
Uh,
market is,
yeah, yeah,
unless they're 6 months old.
right, right,
It's we see this everywhere.
yeah, yeah,
So Native Son has said, okay, we're going to take something of like the AWS approach to this, where we have capacity and we're going to
Mhm.
white label sell that part of capacity. How did that beverage conversation start? Because obviously you're a beer guy coming in from that. And talk us through how Bev started
Sure.
and the life cycle here.
Yeah, so the founder, CEO of Theory, Brandon Pollock, and I, we work together every day. Both craft beer fans, and we, had been kicking around this idea, just seeing some of the very early brands that launched and the challenges they were facing. Right before COVID hit, we decided to build a second production facility next to the first one in Bridgewater, Mass. And you know, as we were kind of thinking about what it was we wanted to produce there and everything, the topic of beverages came back up, and
Hang on one second.
yeah.
So instead of expanding the line that you already had in your current facility, you said, let's just replicate the whole thing in a different facility?
So our first building was it was a grow that was designed by growers. So it had a very small manufacturing space,
I
very
see.
limited vault space. And it was really conceived and put together in 2015. So we're
Okay.
in, you know, late 2019. hitting like unbelievable sales numbers
Yeah.
and making gummies in a closet. Um, and I had retrofitted knockdown walls and moved
You
all
did
the
what you
Lego
could.
pieces around in our
Yeah.
building to get the most out of it we could, but
Yeah.
ultimately it just wasn't enough for the direction we were going. So we were able to, get the plot of land next door and build from the ground up a completely custom building that it basically expanded our flower production capacity. Most of it was the grow rooms, but we were able to build a huge extraction lab, huge manufacturing for gummies and chocolates and all the other solid products we did.
What
And
does
then
huge mean in this context? How many square feet are we talking?
it was probably 4,000 or so for that kind of stuff. So, again, I'm sitting here kind of criticizing the overproduction of cannabis products while, I was part of the problem for
Sure.
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 And when it comes to things like gummies and chocolates, the smallest automated chocolate machine can produce more chocolate than the whole state consumes. So it's not hard to overshoot it on that kind of stuff. Um, but on the kind of last phase of that build out was, we got our heads around like, let's build a canning line and make a cannabis beverage. I was very inspired by, I'm at the time I was on the very strict keto diet, so absolutely no carbohydrates, no sugar, and the drinks were the first like zero sugar, zero calorie edible product that had really come across that wasn't just a worse version of a sugar product
Right.
made with fake chemical sweeteners and stuff. Um, and I would say probably the biggest impetus for it was I went to we had heard of this company Nanogen, which is now Vertosa.
They were
Um,
the ones that were running around saying, "Oh, our molecules are so small, they rapidly get into your body and so on."
yes.
Was that true?
Yes. Yeah. Actually, the Harold Hahn, who is their chief science officer, is a incredibly intelligent scientist, and I believe he hooked himself up to some kind of machine and consumed the cannabis to prove that the rapid onset was, scientifically based. But I had tracked them down at a trade show in New York, and kind of forced my way into a meeting with them. Became friends with the guys, kind of on spec. We did not know how to make the emulsion. I think Source was out there a little bit, but we found these guys and they gave me these little like teeny vials with the THC solution in it. And I came back to Mass and I sat down. I was in my office with Brandon, and I had a Soda Stream, and I whipped up some seltzer on the Soda Stream, and I put that in. We drank it, and we just had this epiphany moment 10 minutes later where we kind of both looked each other in the eye and blinked, and we're like, "Dude, I'm high right now." That's crazy, and it was this real like holy shit, this is a real product. And that one moment really kicked off the whole, like really believing in this project and getting it off the ground.
So technically, you saw the path. But in terms
Yes.
of market, right, I've had this conversation a dozen times over the last decade where it's like beverages are always going to be the next big thing.
Yeah.
So where are we in that timescale? Has beverage taken off the way that people have been talking about? Like we were at one point, there was this 100,000 square foot bottling plant we were specking out on behalf of one of those
Sure.
massive brands,
I've
right?
spec'd out several for groups that never want, once they see how much it costs, it's like, oh,
That's
never mind.
exactly it.
Yeah.
Because from what I understand, you can't really cross lines. Like you can't have a seltzer line and then have THC slipstream into it, clean up, and then pull it out, right? You have to have totally physical separate lines from any traditional beverage that's non THC. Is that true?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, the with proper chemical sanitation of the canning line, you would be destroying any contaminants left in that line. Um,
Would the
you know,
regulators be okay with that?
at least in Massachusetts, they're not. I mean, they're we were not able. You know, I couldn't go to a non-licensed facility and make my product and bring it back into the licensed one. I could have bought a non-licensed facility and gotten it licensed, but you know the all of the THC has to stay within metric in a licensed facility.
Oh,
So
yes. What
really,
I'm
the
getting
only option was building your own production.
understood, but could you use
Yeah.
that own production, that side production, much like you're using for co-packing, right?
Oh,
If
sure.
you build your own, then can you say, okay, we're going to do THC for a week, and then we don't need more capacity for that. Let's just bring in a regular seltzer company.
Right. Yeah, that I don't think you could do. You know, here we're not considered like marijuana product is a legal definition that it means it is
Hmm.
explicitly not food. So I'm not licensed
That's
to
right.
produce food. I'm only
Right.
licensed
Right.
to produce marijuana products. So, and then you're dealing with like beverage production facilities are under the purview of the FDA. They have different safety and compliance standards that, you know, probably wouldn't be worth inviting into your cannabis facility. Um, and frankly, you know, the most, especially in the non-alcoholic world, the only profit in beverages is at, you know, unbelievable scale, and most small beverage brands are a, you know, chance to spend a lot of money to then get purchased by Pepsi or Coke for a significantly larger, you know, no one's like, I'm going to start a seltzer brand and build a small seltzer factory and make a fortune off of that. That's just
Right.
doesn't, that doesn't make any sense.
I get that. So jumping over, you said canned twice, and Manir's question is the same as my question. We actually talked about that in our office.
Yep.
You said canned. Why cans and not bottles? Is it because of the sunlight getting into it, or
Well, sunlight's an important factor. And, you know, when I was in the beer industry, during the time that I was active in it, was when the craft brewers transitioned from bottles to cans. You know, nowadays you go to the craft beer store, it's all
all
canned,
cans?
everything. So there's a lot of reasons for that. The canning technology had was they just weren't at the point where it was small scale for a long time, and the availability and cost of small scale canning equipment finally came into like a economically viable for low levels of production. They're lighter,
Yeah,
they're easier to recycle or are recyclable. Funny story. Do you know what they do with recycled glass in Massachusetts?
I bet they grind it down and add it to concrete.
A little bit, but the primary use is to weigh down trash in landfills.
Are you
So
kidding
they
me?
just throw it in the landfill, but that's how they recycle it. They weigh down the trash in the landfill. So it's not getting recycled.
No, but it is sand, right? At the end of the day, glass
Essentially,
is far like you're not mining aluminum.
sure. Yeah. But it doesn't go back into the glass supply chain. You
No.
know, it's all, yeah.
Well,
Um,
I mean, recycling in general is not exactly what we think it is, especially
yeah.
if China's not taking our crates of crap. Like, all right, that's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole, we can do another podcast on that.
All right, so
But you've got the light, the weight, the
yeah,
breakability. You know, at my beer distributor, with still a lot of beer and glass,
you're
we had a whole warehouse of just to deal with broken cases and bottles and returns and
got it.
cleaning and safety hazards with broken glass. So
Not being
uh,
a chemist, it seems like glass has less opportunity to, I don't know if the word is leach or contaminate. You can taste the difference. Remember back in the day when you would buy a can of Hawaiian Punch and you could taste the can?
yeah,
So
yep.
glass seems to be a better material in terms of purity and non-contamination. How does the canning world address that?
So the modern can, it has a liner inside of it. If you can actually do this, you can dissolve the can in acid, and when you pull it out of the acid, there's a little plastic bag inside of it left
Seriously?
over. Seriously, yeah. So yeah, I mean, any metals are highly reactive substances. There's no perfect metal,
Yeah,
especially most canned products need to be acidic. Um, you're not typically drinking super basic liquids all the time.
no, you're drinking lemon lime. That's
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah. And the preservative methods that, chemical preservatives only work in low pH environments. So you're getting an acidic product. And if you have an acidic product in an aluminum can, you're asking for a problem.
right.
Those are going to react. You're going to get, degradation over time. And I don't know the chemistry of what is leaching into your drink, but it just, you don't want to taste the can. You don't want your cans to have a shorter shelf life than the product itself. So modern cans, they're all lined with, and they make different versions of the liners. There's
Yeah,
BPA liners. People don't like BPA. We used an epoxy liner. Um,
really.
there are, yeah, yeah, all sorts of, there's crazy plastic chemistry going on with all that stuff.
You don't see BPA free sign tags on cans though. Do
Most
people?
cans have a BPA liner, soda can, whatever. It's all
Is
the
that right?
yeah, yep.
It's
It's
funny
I think
how
it's the
narrow
cheapest.
our scope typically is. Like you see all this BPA free stuff. Meanwhile, people drink Diet Coke instead of coffee in the
Yeah,
morning.
yep,
Wow.
yeah. And
So
modern canning wouldn't exist without that. It's
sure.
the Coca Cola is so acidic it would dissolve an aluminum can. After a period of time.
Is that true in terms of the liner for canned vegetables and anything in a can?
I don't really know about like the tin can style, but I would assume so. Yeah, I mean, it's really a plastic container with a metal wall around it.
Ah,
Is the way to look at these things
yeah,
because
that's fascinating.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
really fascinating. So I'm going to jump around a little bit because I have a ton of questions. So when you're sourcing emulsions, are you sourcing the emulsion or are you sourcing the THC and then creating the emulsion? How does that work?
So we partnered with Vertosa, and that's kind of I think it was kind of Vertosa's business model was that they would perform the technical side of creating the emulsion with our THC for our beverages as a service.
So are you providing them with the flour or are you distilling and providing that?
It was
How does that
all distillate based. Yeah, most THC drinks I think are distillate based at
So
this
you're
point.
distilling, giving it to them for their emotion technology, getting it back, and then you're doing the canning,
Yep, we would do the
the
mixing, the
infusion. And
canning. Yeah, exactly.
so
So you get like it looked like milk. It's white when it's concentrated.
interesting.
So you get a big milk jug, um,
What is
and
the emulsion process? Is it like you would do in your kitchen for an emulsion?
very different.
Say more.
Um, it is so to get those, it is spiritually like making an emulsion in your kitchen where you have a surfactant, you have an oil, you have a liquid fraction. Um, the technique to get those to a particular particle size involves some extraordinarily expensive machinery that's typically relegated to the world of pharmaceuticals. And Harold, the chief scientist there, was his background was in making emulsions for pharmaceutical, the food industry. So he applied those techniques to cannabis industry, and they developed a really awesome. It was didn't affect the flavor a lot. That was my goal with High Five, was to start with a tasty drink,
Mm.
and that also got you high. But
Hmm.
I had been around the country and tried other existing cannabis drinks, and noted a distinct kind of aspirin bitterness, astringency to them, that the emulsions are not the tastiest chemicals to be consuming. So you need good potency, you need good particle size, you need good flavor, you need rapid onset. And I look at the business I'm doing. I don't know. I'm not a material scientist. I'm not a chemist. So I want to find someone who is, and is passionate about cannabis, and partner with them to achieve this very critical piece of the puzzle. And then I do my thing with the canning and the sales,
Hmm.
marketing, distribution,
Hmm.
all that.
That makes a ton of sense. So, how do you ensure consistency, right? Because my assumption is that getting it to the emulsion level requires a tremendous amount of flour.
Yeah, I mean the distillate is, we built a huge lab. We were producing our own distillate. It's readily available on the market here. There's
But is
lots
it
of
broken down? Is distillate broken down to the point where all the terps are basically gone, and you're just
Yeah,
dealing with this just simple THC molecule, and that's it?
exactly. Yeah, yeah. It's
So, yeah,
mostly it's around 90+%. We had a threshold of more than 90% THCA or THC, sorry,
yeah.
in the distillate we used. The analytical chemistry to get what other the whatever else the other 10% was, is not not typically performed here
Right.
during testing. But it was really, it got a full third party lab test before it got emulsified. Then we would have pretty extensive post emulsification tests. So we had a good sense of what the true potency was, the true amount of milligrams in the volume of emulsion. And it actually did make for a more consistent product than like gummies or chocolate bars, because
You're breaking it down even further.
yeah, you've got a very uniform particle size, but
Yeah.
then you have a liquid. So the mixing of a liquid, our tanks,
Right.
we would mix all the liquids in, and then had a recirculating pump on the tank, so you would get extremely uniform distribution across the volume,
Yeah.
uh, which made it really a lot easier. And you're not manually dosing anything. It was a
Hmm.
fully automated process. So the consistency of the final product was easier to achieve than any other edible.
Edibles are still inconsistent. They haven't gotten it right.
Sure,
Pretty
yeah.
wild.
I've made a lot of gummies and chocolate bars, and getting enough homogenization in a 180-degree sugar syrup, it's a lot harder, and not an easily achievable thing, especially with the resources that cannabis companies typically have.
So, where does heat play into this at all? Anywhere along the manufacturing process? Are you heating good? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, through the distillate step, that's a heating and cooling
Sure.
process.
Sure.
But
But in the
the
canning
emulsion,
process,
yeah,
you when
canning you want to do cold.
after
CO2.
sterilization it goes cold.
Yeah, so we didn't do any kind of pasteurization process on our
I meant
canning
of
line.
the can itself. You're sanitizing
Oh,
the can. You're
yeah,
yeah.
the cans, they get cleaned out with ionized air and water, so you don't have to bake them or heat them up or anything.
Got it.
No soaps are involved. You
That's
want to
very
avoid
clean.
residues and things,
Yeah.
but the ionized air is actually a fantastic way. It kind of separates every particle away from the liner when it hits it and gets them out of there. So you have a pretty clean can going into the line. And then we use preservatives. Most it's standard preservatives that are in almost every drink. One of the issues, the pasteurization, you could eliminate preservatives with pasteurization, but pasteurization introduces heat, which can degrade your THC. But worse, the amount of heat required limits how much carbonation you can have, because the heat causes
Yeah,
rapid expansion of the CO2,
sure.
and as the liquid gets hot, it cannot dissolve CO2 anymore, so it all shifts to the gas phase.
Oh shit.
And to get certain types of drinks pasteurized, if they're in a can, exceeds the pressure limit of the bottom of the can, which is about 90 psi, which is a lot of. It's double or triple what your car tires are under.
Yeah,
A can can survive.
right.
But you end up, I don't have a can on me, but that little curved end on the bottom of the can blows out into a dome.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, at that point, if you were to actually require that much psi, you'd be looking at a scuba tank. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
There goes your weight.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a challenging scientific kind of quandary on how best to preserve and ensure shelf life. There are there are systems that exist that can help you solve some of those problems, but they're scaled up solutions. So
Yeah.
they're for the seltzer company, normal seltzer company, if they're manufacturing it, they have a 1,000 can per minute canning line. We had a 6 can per minute canning
Yeah.
line.
Right.
The differences are so staggering that the people that make that technology for the real world, like companies that are doing it, they don't scale it down for the stoners trying to dink around on a little my first canning line.
Yeah,
So
yeah, right. The Fisher Price canning line.
yeah.
So I'm gonna again jump around. We were at Hall of Flowers, I want to say 2 weeks ago, and we came home with a bunch of goodie bags as we always do. It's my favorite conference. And I was talking to the Pabst Blue Ribbon guys, right? This is not product placement, but
Yep.
these guys give out a refrigerator to all of these local dispensaries here, and this is almost in every one of them.
Yeah.
You see these larger brands coming into each of these markets, finding a licensing partner, and then using their economies of scale to push out the smaller players.
Sounds a lot like the beer industry. I'll tell you that.
Right.
It's
Well, these are beer guys.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. I've got to meet those guys, and they make a wonderful product, and
They know what they're doing.
that's the strategy. I mean, beer has all this stuff figured out. Yeah, they are running that industry is a well-oiled machine, and giving away refrigerators to stock with your product. So you see a Coca-Cola refrigerator at every convenience store, the Monster Energy drink, that's a tried and true method. Um,
Two
and
questions. Do they require that only their beverages go in that refrigerator? Is that part of the contract?
I'm not sure. They're not in Massachusetts, so I don't deal with them in that kind of capacity here. If
Got it.
if I was giving away refrigerators, I would try to ask for that for
Hell yeah.
sure. Um, you know,
Absolutely.
Managing what all your retailers do is a whole other ball of wax and a huge
Right.
challenge. But
Right. And the other question is, how do you future proof? Because you see it coming. You've been in this situation before. Are you thinking about that? Are you preparing in advance? Or are you just looking at that as a natural cycle that if you have a good enough product and you have a loyal enough fan base, you can weather that storm?
yeah, I think for me, being in the regulated THC space, like there's not a great future for cannabis beverages in what I do. I retail them. Our retail positioning is I essentially sell them for a tiny markup above cost. One of the big issues that the regulated THC, but even hemp face, is that the cost of the THC in proportion to the other ingredients in a can kind of makes it inefficient for the customer. Where you got a couple pennies worth of THC, and then your cost of production can be, for a seltzer, can be $1.50, maybe down to $1. For anything with fruit juice or something in it, higher than $1.50. So if you follow the normal markup patterns that you see in the producer retailer relationship, you're ending up with these $6 for a 5 milligram drink. That just is not exciting to customers, and it's because of regulations that exists. Where you
Seven
got
ninety
the,
nine, seven
yep,
ninety nine for 100 milligram drink.
right. So that's the exact example. I can't do
Yeah.
that here in Massachusetts, unfortunately, except in the medical program. We're strictly limited to 5 milligrams per drink. But if you look at the economics of it, I could add 95 more milligrams to that can for less than
Pennies.
20% of the overall cost. So I have a
Right.
minor cost increase. Then I can mark it up to something that, can make money for myself and the retailer. And then it's a great value for the customer. That's a huge economic efficiency that we just got locked out of in this state because the regulators, they were very explicit about no more than 5 milligrams per individual serving of drinks. And, while we were making high five, we had a medical licensure. We started as a medical company, and we're able to make, 25, 50, 100 milligram cans. And the sales on those, far exceeded what the 5 milligram cans would do because they had that good level of value for the customer.
But you're limited by the number of people that can actually purchase them
Right.
because the medical
With
licensing.
searching, people are just giving up their medical cards. They're closing medical stores here.
Yep.
Um, so
Yep.
that market is kind of closing itself off, unfortunately. And then
Yeah.
you've got hemp on top of that. They've banned hemp drinks in Massachusetts now,
Yeah.
but really, if anyone who's interested in making these things or trying to make it in cannabis drinks, the future of it is in the hemp world. And
Is it, or is it a moment in time that will close when they renew whatever farm bill they're going to?
sure, it might. Yeah,
Like,
it's a highly risky thing.
it's
There's
risky.
Yeah, and if you follow the traditional beverage plan of invest my money into this until it can get bought by someone, that's kind of a risky play if the one stroke of a pen can completely make what you're doing illegal
Right.
again.
That can be true for a lot of things, but in the THC world, the regulated cannabis market, I don't see that pen stroke happening. For hemp,
No,
I can, because the states aren't necessarily dependent on that tax revenue,
right.
and it is a loophole, and it is a far easier thing to control, and far more people are upset about it. So, getting to Jacob's question real quick, it that the you can't take product from the gray market and bring it into the legal market. That's just not an option for anybody operating legally. And further, in Massachusetts, you simply can't make beverages from hemp, Delta 9, right?
So you could. So here, we can use hemp products, but only ones that are grown by a Massachusetts licensed hemp producer, processed by a Massachusetts. They have it's under the MDAR, the Department of Agricultural Resources. So there is a little bit of crossover between the legal hemp and legal cannabis space in Massachusetts
Hmm.
but it's still all contained within the borders of Massachusetts. So
Right.
we don't get any of the advantage of scale that, I can't buy
From
THC
Oklahoma,
from, North
Kentucky.
Carolina,
Yeah.
10,000 acre farm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all limited to just internal to Massachusetts. And then I can't produce a product at my THC facility here and sell it as hemp out of state or anything. They won't give both of those licenses to the same entity.
Right.
So we can bring hemp in and push it down into the THC market here. But you know, the the benefit of that is, we get access to minor cannabinoids and some interesting products, but it's not a huge driver for
Right.
our THC side here.
Right. I mean, in Minnesota, it certainly is. Being out there and going into restaurants and seeing THC drinks on tap, that was pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
Really great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the world. It's funny. My clown shoes distributor is one of the biggest THC drink distributors. It's the same guy. He was a beer distributor. Now that there's all this infrastructure set up of get a truck full of cans, break them down, sell them to people. It's easy to get into that. It's all flowing already, and
Mhm.
so depending on how the legislation goes, if they carve out cannabis beverages, the hemp side of it stays legal. I see that being it's just economically, it's the only way
I
it can work.
completely see
Where
that.
you got one factory produce all of it for the whole country, and
Right.
see the scale there.
Constellation does roll out those massive facilities. What's interesting is when I was talking to the Pabst guys, they were saying that 100 milligram is their best seller. And then we did a little bit of research, and allegedly 47% of the market is 100 THC cans. Does
Oh yeah,
that sounds right to you?
absolutely. Yeah, related to the economics of the production we were just talking about.
Yeah.
The you're making a higher margin at a lower selling point that the customer views as more of a value in those
Right.
high dose
I
ranges.
can't even imagine drinking 100 milligrams, honestly.
It's
Like,
awesome.
is it?
Oh man, yeah. If you find something that's got the real fast acting,
Yeah.
like the emulsion is really proper, that is a wild ride.
I bet. I mean, look, I'm all for adventure. It's, set and setting, as they say.
Yeah,
And in those set and settings, I tend to go for other things that,
yeah, yeah.
whatever. Point being, it's a brave new world in all of this, right? I do
Absolutely.
have one more question about a brave new world. Is there any state which would allow for THC to be infused in alcohol beverages? Or is that just a
I've
cannot?
gotten this question a lot because of my background. A lot of people have asked me this. So I always tell them about, I think this was 2012 or 13 when the original Four Loco launched in
Right,
Massachusetts.
yeah.
I worked for the company that distributed it.
No
Um,
shit.
and we went from a truckload to 10 to 100, and half the warehouse was just Four Loco. So the result of that is the government will not even allow you to put caffeine in alcohol.
Right,
They are definitely not going to let us put cannabis in alcohol.
right.
It's,
So that's
you
at
know,
the FDA level. The FDA is saying you can't put anything into alcohol as an additive.
yes, yeah, yeah. So you can use coffee. That's the only workaround was for coffee stouts. So you can have a naturally occurring source of caffeine in an ingredient to the drink.
How
But
much caffeine does that really put into a can of beer?
it depends. Usually it's not too much coffee. There's a little bit, but if they had gone off of like chemical analysis of the drink, if it contained caffeine, it would have killed all the coffee beers. So they carved them out. But any exogenous caffeine to the beverage is completely banned. And so, yeah, I don't think they are interested in creating combo recreational drug situations and that honestly, that might not be a good thing to start giving out to people. Um, you know, I know a lot of people who cannot handle the alcohol weed combination, and
Oh
having it
yeah,
all packed up in one bottle might be a recipe for
a recipe for a
disaster.
lot of airline bags, if you know what I mean. Like,
Yeah,
you know,
And I was in the alcohol industry a long time, and as I left and joined cannabis, I actually stopped drinking completely. And one of the big motivators for me was the kind of wanting to have something to drink at a party or a barbecue or something that wasn't alcohol,
Yeah,
didn't have any sugar, but still gave me the kind of mind alteration that I
100%.
wanted in those situations. So, I really think a lot of the cannabis beverage side of things is pushed as an towards alcohol replacement, which ultimately I think is good for people. I spent a lot of time in alcohol. I used to tell people I sold happiness,
For a
and
moment.
for a moment, now I truly believe that. I think
Yeah,
cannabis is it's not a poison to your body.
no.
It doesn't have the social and economic health impacts that alcohol has. People aren't. Alcohol is serious poison and causes a lot of pain and suffering in the world. And cannabis. I think the cannabis beverage movement is a big push of helping to stop that. Um,
I absolutely agree with that. And I also see that canned beverages are it's a straight path to more market share, to greater
mhm.
exposure and so on, right? What I don't see is how the folks that are trying to make a spirit with THC, I don't see that as being viable right now. The formulations just they don't taste good to me, right?
Yeah.
As a consumer, it's just not quite there yet. What is the I mean, obviously putting an emulsion into a can with bubbles and water and so on, very straightforward. On the spirit side, are you familiar with how they process that? How's that different?
I think the emulsion's relatively the same. It's the emulsion itself. There's a lot of play with the emulsion. It's like the particle size controls the onset, right? Like a smaller particle size, faster onset, but smaller particle size has a exponential increase in surface area. So the really small particle size emulsions are the ones that taste the worst because they hit your olfactory senses so much more than a larger particle size. So that's why I love Vertosa. They had the backup, the proof of all of the different testing they did, all the different sizes, the flavor analysis, the sensory analysis, and the true hard particle size data to correlate it with. So we were able to develop the seltzer, which really doesn't have anything to cover up that flavor in it. There's no sugar to offset the bitterness. There's barely any flavoring. So they were able to help us really build a formulation that didn't taste like it had, you know, it's the stuff's basically a chemical soap. So I always would say it doesn't taste like it has soap in it, but in reality, there was some emulsion in there. I haven't tried. I had one of those spirits. I don't remember the brand, um, but it was really high dose, and I think that was the proportion of emulsion to non-emulsion ingredients was very different than a seltzer, where maybe I put a milligram out of 355 in a can, maybe less, versus one of these things. So the science and technology, like there's not a lot of investment capital coming into building the next better cannabis emulsion. There's some stuff that works, and right now I think the challenge is like playing around with the different levers that you can pull in formulating your beverage to make it taste good. And to me, priority one should be taste good, and
Right.
then the efficacy of the cannabis is number two, because people do not want to drink stuff that doesn't taste good.
I completely agree with that. And they also don't, generally speaking, in the social setting, want to go too far.
Yeah.
Like you want to be able to, drinking beer. You can have beer throughout the night and not go completely overboard. to have that same effect with a cannabis drink means that it's a fairly low dose for
Yep.
most people in a social setting, anyway.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think the 5 milligram is a great entry point. You know,
Yeah,
it's very familiar to people too. Like, it kind of matches beer in a way where, if you have one an hour, you're not going to get that drunk. You're not going to get
right,
that high.
right.
If you slam a six pack in 15 minutes, you're going to get drunk. You're going to get high. And one of the interesting things I noticed out, I was I this was a great time for me. I had during COVID, I married my wife in our backyard and had my whole family there and had, we had an open bar, but we also had open bar of high five cannabis drinks. And, my 80-year-old great aunt, who never would have smoked cannabis ever, was like, "Oh, it's a drink. I'll try that." And
Amazing.
that familiarity with, like, it's a can of liquid that gets me kind of buzzed, just
Yeah,
really clicks with people, of all ages and of all backgrounds. And I just really loved it about that part of the product was, it could expand the reach of cannabis into markets where, someone would never smoke a joint,
right.
um, but try something that's, a little more familiar to them. And I think that's a big reason why you see, like, in Minnesota or Florida or whatever, the adoption of these things is, like, lightning fast, and they're spreading out very rapidly, and it's you know inherent to the process of getting your buzz on.
So it's really interesting because what's occurring to me is, in 2017 and 18, we're building tons of stores in Canada, and nearly every one had an education center because all of the retailers thought, oh, we're going to bring in a whole new set of buyers, and these people have no exposure. It's the boomers and older. Well, now that it's accessible and it's legal, they'll come in and they'll want to learn and so on. But to your point, the form factor was just wrong.
Yeah,
Nobody wants to buy a pre-roll if they're not a smoker. But
right.
looking at a can, that is a very familiar experience, and it does open up that avenue to a whole new line of consumer. And so if we're looking at it a percentage of, you know, the cannabis market, that's one thing. But if we're looking at it as a percentage of what people would buy in the alcohol market, well, that's a different set of math.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating. And God bless your great aunt. That is wonderful.
Yep. I tell that story a lot.
That's
And
great.
yeah, yeah,
That's great. And a good place for us to put a pin in this until another time. Matt, thank you so much for your time today and for joining us on our periodic conversation that we have. When we find interesting topics and very interesting and great people, we bring them on and have a great conversation. So thank you for your time. Have a great day and an awesome weekend, Matt. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
thank you very much for having me. And you have a great weekend too, and we'll talk soon.
Amazing. All right. Take care.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.